Thanks very much, Tim. We'll go through to the next slide and to the next slide, thank you. So InteliCare, as said, we've got an AI technology using Internet of Things smart sensors that allows people to live independently in their own home. We've seen strong market trends in this area as baby boomers increase the pressure on traditional care providing models. And following a successful listing at the height of COVID in May 2020, we've started to really execute on our commercialisation strategy, which fundamentally revolves around our software as a service or SaaS product. Next slide. This market has enormous macro trends. We've recently seen, following the Royal Commission and the federal budget, a massive increase in government funding in this arena. And this is reflected across all Western democracies, with President Biden recently committing $400 billion to their aged care sector, with the fundamental premise of trying to keep people in their own homes and out of residential care. Next slide. Since we listed, we've experienced great market traction. Our increase in installed units has gone up by about 18 times. When we first listed, we had about 25 units in the field, and that's now increased to about 450 units sold. We've expended 65,000 development hours, which is really the moat around our product and our IP. Next slide. In terms of the market, we're talking about not only the aged care market, but the disability care market. And combined, these represent about $40 billion of government funding, which is increasing. But alongside this, we're also tapping into the direct-to-consumer market. That is, those people who do not receive any form of funding and wish to fund their own aged care out of their own pocket, like the equivalent of self-managed super. Next slide. Unfortunately, this market stress is creating a lot of issues with traditional aged care providers. Residential care, which is what most people think of when they think about aged care, nursing homes, 51% are unprofitable, and the home care industry is finding it difficult more and more to create EBITDA per client. As I said, the government has tipped more money into this arena, but there is still an enormous number of people awaiting home care packages. Next slide. So the fundamental issue is that we have an increasing demand with a declining tax base. So therefore, people wish to stay in their own home and age in place. When they do that, the traditional technology they turn to are pendants and duress devices. Unfortunately, in 80% of the cases where someone has a fall, they don't use these devices because it's either not charged or it's not on them. But even in 30% of falls, they don't press it anyway because they don't want to tell their family they've got a problem, and they're fearful of finding themselves in a nursing home. Next slide. So what we do is we install passive sensors. They don't require the resident to activate anything or to charge anything. They consist of movement sensors, power sensors, door sensors. And using our AI, we then build up a pattern of behaviour in that home. When we look at when they get up each day, how much movement's around the house, when they're preparing meals, and whether they're socially isolated. And from there, we can send alerts out to families and caregivers when something's out of the ordinary. So not only do we have the ability to detect an incident that might otherwise trigger a loss of independence, but more importantly, using AI, we aim to prevent those incidents occurring in the first place so that we don't find someone too late. Next slide. So we built up a platform from the ground up where the core intelligence is at the passive detection level. We've also integrated then a range of emergency alert devices, including wearables such as smart watches and pendants. But we also have, on top of that, integrated devices like Fitbit and Apple Watch to look at vital signs and health metrics. So through this layered approach, we build a very holistic picture of how these people are living independently in their own home. Next slide. We then market that through two products, InteliCare Pro, which is designed for professional care organisations. So these are the organisations that deliver in-home care and often also have a residential care business as well as the family-friendly B2C app, which is the InteliLiving app. So that family members have the same insight as a caregiver to the professional caregiver and can become participative in that person's wellbeing. Next slide. We look at three or four core verticals. Firstly, those who are living independently in their own home. Governments are also a target of ours because reduced transmission pathways for COVID, and more importantly, it's a mechanism for them to reduce the overall burden of the tax base on aged care. And also hospitals, we're talking to them regarding how it can reduce readmissions, which is a major cause of concern for them because it increases the waiting lists. And lastly, with insurance, particularly in overseas markets, there is the ability to reduce their underwriting risk as their population and their client base ages. Next slide. As I said at the outset, it's a SaaS product, so we charge for the hardware up front, and then we also have an ongoing subscription fee. The hardware we've marketed about 34 to 40% gross margin, so there's room to manoeuvre and bring that down to increase market share. And also the subscription fee at scale is very high margin, 80 to 90%. So you can think of it a bit like the telcos, where they'll provide an affordable mobile phone or a smartphone, but they're looking to have ongoing subscriptions as their fundamental revenue base. Next slide. So through that, we market B2B through the aged and disability care providers. This represents about 80% of our business at this stage, and there's about 1 million people in Australia in this market. The larger market that we've just started to attack is the B2C market, and this is targeting direct to the end users, in particular the families, and it's 3 to 4 times the size of the federally funded market. And lastly, also through distributors and agents who have already an established market of selling into aged or disability care, particularly technology and assistive technology providers who might be providing mobility devices and other systems direct to both the consumer and also to our businesses. Next slide. As I said, we have recently really started to attack the B2C market in earnest. We created a marketing campaign here in Western Australia that went out through both television and radio, as well as digital and online. We saw an enormously exciting response, in particular to the TV ads. And you can see there was a direct response when we ran the ads. We expected this just to be an awareness campaign to boost awareness, with returns not really visible for 6 to 12 months. But in reality, we've started to get strong returns in the first instance as we're starting to convert those leads. Our marketing people described that they haven't seen such a direct response to a TV ad except for the MS Home lottery ads, where people go straight from the ad and then seconds later hit the website. Next slide. In the future, in our roadmap, we're looking really to move from that detection to prediction. So we are integrating next generation sensors and devices. We don't look to manufacture our own sensors. We're an open architecture platform, meaning we can strap on the best and brightest that are out there. In particular, there's a lot of movement in fall detection technology, which we've integrated onto our platform already. We've engaged the University of New South Wales and our own resources to increase our machine learning capability. So we're now starting to tap into this larger database, so that rather than using more coarse forms of artificial intelligence, we're using smarter and smarter machine learning to look at those patterns of behaviour and predict likely events in the future, and then for our carers to get in front of it. And lastly, integrating our system with EMR and case management systems of care providers, so that the outcome that they seek in terms of modified care plans is automatically in the workflow. Next slide. Our core management team consists of myself and the board that was restructured prior to the IPO. Greg and Mike are the co-founders, who are both still on board and significant shareholders. We have a significant pedigree of experience in both founding and exiting from technology. Next slide. So since listing, there's a lot of excitement at the height of the COVID crisis with our listing, but we've settled down since then. We still have board and management as a significant share base, and we recently raised another 2.5 million to start expanding on the East Coast and we're recruiting to those positions right now. We recently recruited a Chief Revenue Officer to drive that growth. Next slide. So looking at the macro trends, this is a way for investors to gain exposure into that aged care sector. There's very few direct mechanisms for exposing your portfolio to that macro tailwind. I think the use of smart technology is going to become the norm in the future, and it's up to us now to grab that market share. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Jason. I suppose an obvious question is how has COVID impacted your ability to work with aged care homes?
It's been a real double-edged sword. So in the short term, the aged care industry is swamped by both the Royal Commission and COVID, so that reduces their bandwidth and their ability to engage somewhat. And of course, it's reduced our ability through, the same as everyone else, to travel to the East Coast, which is why we're recruiting on that seaboard. But more long term, it's very positive because it has done two things. Firstly, it's demonstrated that residential aged care should be a safety net, not a destination, and that ageing in place is the preferred pathway. But secondly, it has accelerated the adoption of technology both within the aged care industry, but also by the elderly themselves.
And something like the National Disability Housing Scheme, which I've spoken to people about before, have you looked to work with the people who are actually building the houses to embed this your technology into that housing?
Yes, we have specialist disability accommodation, or SDA housing. It's very prospective for us, and we had our first success in Victoria recently, where we've installed 25 systems into SDA housing there, with the aim that the on-site carers can manage these people remotely rather than having to pop into the units all the time. Government is investing about $700 million a year into that type of housing. So it's longer term because you have to get in front of the development curve and speak to the developers at the outset of the project. But I think it's very exciting because the disability sector in general is a lot more receptive to technology and assistive technology. They're far more engaged than the aged care sector at this stage.
And ultimately, the data you extract from a nursing home or aged care facility and have those all around Australia, what sort of insights can you gain from that data from a commercial sense as well?
Fundamentally, it allows people to customise their care plans so that government funding is often linked to the level of care that person requires, and anecdotal and survey evidence is what's currently used to support and justify an increase in that plan, which means it's inefficient, so it's not aligned to the care needs. We find that each individual is different, but there are some consistent trends. So I think in the future, we would see through our APIs and our data lake, the use of this data to start to inform clinical research. So for things like dementia, cardiopulmonary disease, and frailty, there can be some clinical outcomes that are achieved by looking at our data trends.
And just finally, is there any lessons to be learned from kind of overseas, your peers and your competitors in those markets?
Absolutely. We see the markets as moving both in, say, the UK and the US and Canada in tandem. They're all coming to grips with what's going on. In the US, at times, 75% of the residents in a nursing home unfortunately passed away. So the boards of those organisations are very, very much now looking to the future at how they build out their new care models. They realise they can't do what they've done in the past. And so we're trying to tap into those, and expansion of those markets is very much part of our roadmap at